Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue, and we are getting another day closer to the Big Ten championship game between Penn State and Oregon, number 3 versus number 1 in the nation, this Saturday night in Indianapolis. We're going to have a chance to break down this matchup from a lot of different angles here on the episode. Daniel Gallen is about to join me to break down everything we've heard from Penn State and seen on the practice field this week and some keys to the game as we see them for the Nittany Lions. Normally, you'd hear from Mark Brennan on these Thursday episodes. We've done that all season, but tricky travel situation this week with having just a few days to plan a long trip, and he's actually on the road today due to some weather. His schedule got rearranged a bit, so he's not going to be on this episode, but don't worry. We have his predictions. We have his players to watch, and so we'll incorporate that later. You'll hear from Mark early next week. He's on his way to Indianapolis. He will be inside the press box along with Daniel Gallen this Saturday. So coverage coming your way at Lions247.com. We also are going to break down the Ducks. I think I promised that in our last episode, but we spent more time breaking down signing day with Tyler Calvaruso on Wednesday. Didn't want to shortchange that conversation. If you missed it, go check that out. It's our last episode. We broke down the 2025 recruiting class, but that bumped our Oregon breakdown into this episode. So that will follow our conversation on Penn State and our predictions today. Daniel and I will work through that. We'll give you our score picks, and then you will hear from an Oregon insider within our 24/7 Sports Network to talk about this 12-0 Duck squad, how they got to this point, what challenges they present, where they might be susceptible to being exploited, and we'll get into all that in just a bit. But first, as promised, Daniel Gallen joins us here on the podcast. Daniel, game number 13 just ahead of us. You will be flying to Indianapolis on Friday, and as I said, you two will be in the press box on Saturday. But here on a Thursday, we are starting to really wrap our heads around the grand scale of what lies ahead for the Nittany Lions. This is a highly anticipated matchup across the nation for college football fans. There may be more eyeballs on this Penn State team than any time in recent seasons outside of an Ohio State or Michigan matchup, of course. And then naturally, you've got Oregon, who's motivated, fired up to stake their claim to a Big Ten championship. And that would be quite a statement in year number 1 as a conference competitor.
Yeah, you look at the big picture from like the 10,000, 20,000, however many foot view, and there's just a lot of different storylines, and there's a lot of different places that this result can go, that this result can take you. I think that, on the one hand, it's really exciting for Penn State. Like, this is what you play for. I think that, some of the players this week were asked that question, along the lines of like, some people are saying that, oh, maybe it's better to be the 5 seed and have a better path. And, there might not be like college football playoff value from winning a Big Ten title. And, all the players were like, well, we want to win a conference championship. Like, you want to win the Big Ten. And you talk about the way that Penn State does things. You win the Big Ten, you get your year, up on the suites on the one side of the stadium, and you get immortalized in that. So I think that we got to the point where, we got some juice, we got some excitement for it, and just a ton of storylines that I'm looking forward to breaking down with you here.
Yeah, we're going to get into those in just a moment. Penn State looking for a 2024 sweep of Pac-12 transplants. They already handled business against UCLA, USC, and Washington over the course of the regular season. And Daniel referenced it there. The playoffs are looming beyond this. We think very confidently that Penn State has a playoff matchup ahead of it beyond Indianapolis, regardless of how things play out. But a win in Indianapolis, yes, it gets that 2024 up on Beaver Stadium. It gives you kind of a piece of program history, but it will give you a first-round bye, and it will springboard you into a national quarterfinal matchup on a neutral site. Unfortunately, that means you don't get a playoff game in Beaver Stadium this year, but you get to bypass that challenge and punch your ticket to that next level, and that means you're just 3 wins away from bringing a national championship trophy to Happy Valley. You could be the number 1 seed overall in this tournament, too, for Penn State. You're probably going to need some help and have Texas lose to Georgia in the SEC championship game. But Oregon would definitely be the number 1 team if they were to get the 13-0 on Saturday. So high stakes for this game. And let's get into some of our game week updates that could ultimately impact what happens Saturday. And we'll start with an update on Harrison Wallace, wide receiver for Penn State, leads that position, I should say, in receptions and receiving yards on the season. He's got about double the amount of catches than any other receiver on this team. He was not available against Maryland, although he was in uniform, went through a bit of pregame work out there on the field. And ultimately, James Franklin told us earlier this week that he had tweaked something, and it was too early to tell what his availability would look like Saturday. Wednesdays are helpful for us, Daniel. We get to go out there. We get our 15-minute look at this team on the field during the course of a week. We have done that all season long. And lo and behold, number 6 was out there in receiver drills, going through what we would typically see from him. And so James Franklin said things were going good in terms of a trajectory with Harrison Wallace. He didn't elaborate beyond that, and you wouldn't really expect him to. But I know you'll have the binoculars on Wallace come pregame in Indy. But obviously, if he is available, and this would be a sign that maybe he's trending in that direction, it avoids a potential binding situation for this team, because where you're having to rely on guys in different roles against an Oregon team that is a true challenge for you, maybe you can have that mainstay. I know it's not an 80 reception season for Harrison Wallace, but it's very clear going back to last year, really, that Drew Aller trusts him, is comfortable with him, and he really has been relatively reliable, albeit not an explosive fireworks presence at receiver.
He's a very, very important piece of this offense. I think we saw it in that season opener against West Virginia last year, and I think a lot of that is kind of carried over, where he's really important to keeping this team on schedule, to moving the chains. I think that we probably pigeonholed him as that vertical threat, go up and get it, jump ball guy. But he's looked really good at going over the middle, finding some soft spots in the zone, getting past the first down marker, moving the chains. Earlier this year, we've seen him do some nice things with the ball in his hands too. So obviously, Penn State wide receivers, it's always going to be a conversation. What are you getting out of them? What is their ceiling? What they can do? But I think going into a game like this, you need your number one wide receiver. We know that Tyler Warren is going to take the majority of the attention of both the Oregon defense and the Penn State offense. But Wallace, I think, is very valuable. He's got good chemistry with Drew Aller. There's an element of trust there. And I think that this is something where Drew Aller is going to need to look to him, and Wallace is going to have to be in a position to deliver.
Yeah, just a quick lay of the land on the receiver situation with or without Wallace. Wallace was the only receiver to start each of the first 11 games. Most of these receivers have started clusters of games. He has been a mainstay in that starting lineup. 45 receiving yards in 7 straight games. You look around this receiving group, it's been 3 other guys who've been involved on a consistent basis: Liam Clifford, Julian Fleming, and Omari Evans. Evans has made 3 straight starts, and he has back-to-back productive games. When you look through his first 7 Big Ten matchups, he had 33 total receiving yards. So you're kind of hoping that what you saw at the end of conference play can carry over to the postseason for Omari Evans, who was really impressive in non-conference action, but couldn't sustain that in Big Ten play. And then Julian Fleming and Liam Clifford, we've heard so much good things about their presence, their impact, their leadership. But when it comes to production, the last 5 matchups for Penn State, Liam Clifford, 3 catches, 33 yards. Julian Fleming during those 5 games, 4 catches, 28 yards, and a touchdown. So again, you take Harrison Wallace away from that equation, it brings up some questions about who you can count on in some volume looks against Oregon. When you look at the defensive side of the ball, Elliott Washington is a player that has been missing from action the last couple of matchups. He went out early against Purdue back in mid-October, and we had not seen him on the practice field the last couple of weeks. That changed on Wednesday. He was out there with the cornerbacks. He was going through some drill work with defensive backs. Now, when players took the field and we saw them go out with a dime look using 6 defensive backs, he wasn't one of those 4 cornerbacks on the field in that instance. It was still a Davian Collins on the perimeter. You also saw A.J. Harris, Jalen Kimber, and then I'm missing a guy here, Zion Tracy. Tracy. There's so many of these darn cornerbacks that they play. But Elliott Washington is a guy who played 25-plus snaps in 8 straight games before he went down with this injury. You're going up against the most accomplished, the most experienced quarterback in college football. And we'll learn more about Dillian Gabriel a little bit later on this show from a Ducks insider. But this is a tremendous test with the way he can carve up opponents. And I just imagine, even if he's not a guy who's ready to get back up to 30-plus snaps in his first game back off this, having him available and perhaps ready to play and prepared to make an impact, that just gives you more bullets in the chamber for this defensive backfield, because they're going to be trying to really get after them with Gabriel over the course of this matchup.
I think when you look at the matchup between this pass offense and this pass defense, if you're Penn State, you need to have as many bodies as possible on the back end, because you don't know how things are going to go over the course of a game. You don't know if someone has the worst game of their life at the wrong time. You don't know if there's an injury, something unexpected. So if you can have Washington available, I think that's a really good boost for them. We saw him play. He was getting some, I think, what you would classify as first team run on the outside over the course of the year. And that was something that expanded. You mentioned that dime package, and he's been a stalwart on that on the outside opposite Jalen Kimber, with Tracy and Harris working in the slot. And so, he does have a role, but Davian Collins has looked really good these past couple of weeks. He's someone who I think we were expecting to see it a little bit earlier in the year, but we've seen that edge that he plays with. We've seen him be able to make some plays. It appears like he's always around the ball. And so I think that if you're Penn State, if Washington is limited or can't go or what have you, you feel good about what Davian Collins has brought to you this year. So Terry Smith, we talk about it all the time, like the job that he's done with this cornerback room of not only stockpiling talent, but retaining it and developing it. It's just been a really, really impressive job. And I think this is where you see the fruits of your labors in a game like this.
We had kind of discussed for the first couple of months of the season, we're not seeing the preseason, offseason buzz for Davian Collins come to fruition. He's not really a factor on defense, getting work on special teams, getting some reserve work. Well, all of a sudden, one guy goes down, he steps up, and it feels like the defensive backfield hasn't missed a beat. And so that's a credit to Terry Smith, as you said, and Davian Collins for staying patient, waiting his turn, and all of a sudden he's coming up with his first career interception, his first career sack, and could be in the spotlight again in Indianapolis against a highly potent passing attack. And when we look at this week collectively, Daniel, I think we've all been on a journey since Saturday, just experiencing this and realizing that this game was in front of Penn State and realizing that you were going to be getting on a plane to go cover this thing. But it seems like there's been kind of an energy shift in the Lash building, speaking with some players, speaking with some staff members over the course of this week. I got the sense that Saturday night into Sunday was a bit of a fog, a good fog, where, oh my gosh, we got another game to play. We got to get back to work. But there was a moment to really enjoy and appreciate the fact that they were able to finish at 11-1, bounce back from that Ohio State game, put themselves in a position to have a high seed in the college football playoff. But it seems like when they got to work Monday, that film came on and it started to sink in just how impressive this Oregon team has been. I know there's a lot of respect for Ohio State and what they are every year, but I think there's a strong case to make this is the biggest challenge in front of Penn State so far in 2024. And as all position rooms started to realize what they were tasked with, and the coaching staff understood that, even with signing day looming in front of everybody, just feels like there's a bit of a laser focus, because it went from kind of a, wow, we've entered this new territory, we get to play for a Big Ten championship game, versus, okay, the Ducks are in front of us, the clock is ticking, and 8 p.m. Saturday is going to come whether we are ready or not. Whereas Oregon's been kind of carving out room mentally and physically for this matchup for much longer, it feels like. It was kind of thrusted upon Penn State in the best of ways. And it's been kind of interesting to read the team as they've processed it.
Definitely. James Franklin always talks about after a win, like, we're going to enjoy this tonight and it's back to work tomorrow. I don't think that when Saturday started, he necessarily had that in his post-game comments, but that line. But I was at the BJC on Sunday covering Penn State basketball, and I went out to my car after the game, and you could hear Penn State out on the practice fields. You heard someone over the loudspeaker telling them to get ready to go stretch, and that's kind of the reality. You really had to quick pivot this week. Is definitely a unique situation. I know that James Franklin downplayed it a little bit. I think Mark asked him what the challenge was of getting ready for this team on short notice. Because when you think about normal Big Ten championship matchups, there's a shared history there. The teams might have played earlier that season or, within the past 2 or 3 years. So you do have something to fall back on. I mean, this is a completely new opponent. I think both coaches mentioned that when you're watching film of other teams, certain things stick out. But but I think that subplot is interesting. The one thing hearing both Dan Lanning and James Franklin talk about was, they really kind of downplayed what the maybe contingency plans were or the look ahead plans were, maybe from the support staff. Because the way that Lanning and Franklin and a lot of the players talked about it was, yeah, this is like our first time, really looking at the other team, and our first time, really diving in, and there wasn't much preparation, which I think is interesting when you consider how these coaches talk about preparing for everything and these staff sizes and what some of those roles are. But yeah, I think the players understand the magnitude of this game. There's been the classic Penn State. We're trying to go 1-0 this week. I think that there's been a couple times where, with questions to players like, oh, like, what do you think about, X player on the other team? He's really good. And you hear the Penn State players are just kind of like, yeah, like, it's another week. Like, we know who we're going against every week. Like, everyone's good at this point. So I think there is that quiet confidence from Penn State. Definitely an element of like, I'd never say a team is scared going into a game, but I think that they realize that Oregon is really good and it's a challenge. But at the same time, I think that they can really fall back on what they've accomplished this season, going 11-1, and being really impressive in a lot of those games, overcoming a lot, having a ton of different experiences, and how that can be applied on Saturday night in Indianapolis.
And they are the underdog. It's not a normal circumstance for these Nittany Lions. It's 15 of the previous 16 games they've been considered the favorite going back to last November. So 3.5 points, not a big spread in favor of the top-ranked team in America. But Penn State is the underdog, and Oregon is largely expected to win this game when you just kind of take the national pulse. We'll give you our predictions just a little bit down the road, but some specific storylines here for this game. I think we got to begin with James Franklin and his history versus elite opponents, because it comes up in conversation every time one of these matchups come up, and it really comes up in conversation if they pick up an L. So 3-19 against top 10 opponents during his time with Penn State, 11 seasons. Of course, stinging one of those occurred back in November 2nd against Ohio State, 7-point loss in Beaver Stadium to the Buckeyes, an 8th straight loss against Ohio State. Always feels a little bit like PTSD on those Sundays and Mondays after these matchups among the Penn State football community. Here's a chance to really cast that aside as best you can and really pivot and launch your way into the college football playoff, potentially at an all-time high in year number 11 for James Franklin with the win. Daniel, what do you make of this opportunity specifically for the head coach? We talked about this program. We talked about the team, the brand, the players. What about for the man who leads the way?
Yeah, I mean, I think Saturday is really big when you talk about, I don't want to throw the legacy word around too much, but I think that this could be a very defining win for James Franklin and his tenure at Penn State. I think that you can frame that mark against the top 10 opponents however you want. I know that James Franklin has gotten a lot of credit for keeping those games close, and they've won a couple of those here and there, but that's the classic cliche, like, you are what your record says you are. And I think that for Penn State, their record against these elite teams under James Franklin, it shows what James Franklin kind of alluded to back in 2018, and what we've kind of said, that they're a great team, but it's hard to classify them as an elite team. They're on that second tier. I think in a lot of respects, especially in the Big Ten, they're kind of like the only team on that tier, if you can frame it however you want. But this is one of those things that you take that step forward. And this is what you thought when you brought that class of 2022 in, because you had all those 5-star recruits. That was a very highly nationally ranked class, and you looked at it as a potentially transformative group that has elite players. And if you have enough elite players, that should help make an elite team. So we'll see how that shakes out on Saturday night. I was on an Oregon podcast earlier this week, and they asked me kind of the same question about it. And, I remarked that, there probably will be a segment of people who might discount a win like this because it's not Ohio State or Michigan. Like, it's not number one Ohio State. It's not number one Michigan, but this is a damn good Oregon team. They're number one for a reason. There's a reason they're the only undefeated team in the country. And so I think if you're James Franklin and you win this game, it's a huge feather in your cap. And I think it really, just is the greatest example of how far this program has come and where it is at this point in time.
Outside the head coach, who wears wins and losses more than a quarterback? And Drew Aller, of course, has put together a lot of really pretty impressive numbers over the course of his 2 seasons as starter. He's number 4, I believe, all time in passing touchdowns at Penn State. If he were to come back next year as a senior, he'd had a chance to really set a lot of records as a quarterback. But again, judged on who you're beating, and 0-3 combined against Michigan and Ohio State. Those games were very ugly offensively. You think back to the Ole Miss game last year when it was opt-out central for Penn State. It was not poetry in motion for that Penn State offense. They didn't connect with a wide receiver through the air until the fourth quarter of that matchup. And here we are again. Drew Aller, about 12 points higher on his completion percentage in 2024 versus 2023. He's been far more consistent, been far more demonstrative as a leader, been a lot more athletic on the field, which has led to some key first downs, an ability to avoid sacks and extend plays through the pass game. And yet many who are going to tune into this game will still largely view him as the kid who lost to Ohio State and Michigan and didn't look so good doing it. And this is supposed to be the best quarterback in the country from his recruiting class. Could be a real coming out party for Drew Aller if they were able to get this done. But it also comes with the risk of Drew Aller not performing all that well. And I think there's a conversation to be had as, is he a game manager for Penn State, or is he, let me go win you the game for Penn State? And this is a scenario where if it's as close as we think it could be late into the game, he could have that kind of a moment. And then across the field, you've got Dillon Gabriel. He's about 1,000 yards away from becoming the all-time leader in passing yards in NCAA history. He's got 18,000 passing yards in his career. 18,000. He's got ridiculous numbers, and he's done it at Central Florida. He's done it at Oklahoma. He's done it at Oregon. He's worked his way up the college football food chain, and he has posted huge numbers at each of those stops. And so, to me, Dillon Gabriel, I think a lot of people know what to expect more from in this game versus Drew Aller. We have been watching Drew closely for the last 12 games, for an entire year, monitoring his progress. What do you make of this quarterback matchup?
It's really, really intriguing. Our conversation on Lions 24/7 this week has been really, really fun. Our community is great. And I got a chuckle where I think you put down Dillon Gabriel's pass yardage in a story, and one of our posters was like, wait, what? Is that accurate? Yeah. I mean, it's crazy when you look at it and when you think about it. But it is kind of two different sides of the coin, where you have someone like Gabriel who has seen it all, done everything. Played at UCF, played at Oklahoma, now winning games in the Big Ten. And then, rightly or wrongly, I think the perception of Drew Aller nationally is that he's still green and he's still on the younger side. And, we still don't quite know what we have in him. Whether that's rightly or wrongly. I mean, at this point, he's played a ton of football. He's been a starter for 2 years, which in college football, given how short of a time period it typically should be, is a really long time. There's a lot of data points on him. And so, I think that Aller is in a position where he can really open some eyes, change some perceptions. I think that he's someone where, when you talk about the prospect analysis and the player analysis, especially through an NFL draft lens, people will point out that, these things that we're hearing about how he could be a potential, day 1 pick, high day 2 pick, how does that align with what he does, with what his stats are, what he does, against Ohio State and Michigan in those situations. I think that Aller is someone who really has the chance to change perception of him, maybe introduce himself to the nation a little bit more. Like you said, those Ohio State and Michigan games are the marquee games he's played in. They're the big noon Saturday games that everyone has been watching. Maybe they had a pretty big audience for that USC game where, which is probably one of the finest games of his career, even with a couple bad interceptions in there. But this is going to be the time where, all the eyes are on him. He can really show what he's capable of doing, the quarterback that he's developed into. And you mentioned it. People might see him as the kid who loses to Ohio State, the kid who was really upset last year in Columbus. I think that he can come out and really showcase that development for Penn State on Saturday night.
So two things off of that quarterback conversation. Both of these teams have a legitimate top-end pair of pass rushers at the top of their depth chart on the edge. Penn State, we know Abdul Carter, Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. Congratulations to him for that. Deni Dennis Sutton flashing that 5-star status at different points this year, more often lately, now that he's getting healthy again off of that October injury. And then you look across the board, you've got Mateo, I don't want to butcher this. I think I got it right. Mateo Uiagalelei. And if I got that wrong, I apologize. But he leads the Big Ten Conference with 10.5 sacks. And then Jordan Birch, who was the top-ranked defensive end in his recruiting class, he's got 8.5 sacks, and he missed a few games. So that number could have been higher. He could have led the Big Ten in sacks potentially. Abdul Carter has 10 of them. So then, when you think about that and what both quarterbacks are going to be facing off the edge, I think the running games are huge. I think the ability to find balance, take some of that pressure off your passing attack, off of the passing pocket is key. And across the board, they've got a 1,000-yard rusher in Jordan James. He's a guy who went from their number 2 back last year to their primary back this year, and he's paid off. He's got 6 100-yard games in the season. He's averaging almost 6 yards per carry, almost 1,200 yards on the ground thus far. And Nick Singleton has been the hot hand for Penn State of late. It hasn't been 100-yard games, but he has been showing that burst and acceleration and the field stretching tendencies that separate him as a running back and earned him the 2022 Big Ten Freshman of the Year and really made us think he was all the way back earlier this year. He may be all the way back now, and it may be at the right time. And my big question mark here, and as I tie it all together for you, Daniel, does Penn State consider leaning into Nick Singleton? And especially early in this game to get him a chance to establish himself versus Series 2, you see Katron Allen. Series 4, you see Katron Allen. Because Allen's been pretty ineffective. 6 of the last 8 games, under 4 yards per carry. Nick Singleton trending in a different direction. And against this Oregon defense that flashes speed across every position, don't you want to match that with some elite speed? I know they've done a great job through 3 years now of balancing this thing, but it's time to show your cards. And I just wonder if that's not the potential pathway for Penn State on this Saturday.
I think it'll be really game flow dependent with those running backs. Like I do think we'll see Katron Allen a decent amount, but if things get weird early, like we saw against Minnesota, where you get to halftime and I think Singleton only had 5 carries, Allen didn't have a carry, then maybe Penn State gets out of rhythm, and then maybe things look a little bit different. But I do think that if you can figure out how to establish things with Nick Singleton early, get him into that second level. Then maybe you can, we've seen Drew Aller use his legs too. Maybe if Aller is that +1 in the run game, maybe you can keep those 2 pass rushers and make them hesitate just a little bit more. And that can help Aller in the pass game. That can help Singleton in the run game. I think that, in order for Penn State to beat this Oregon team, they have to be really well-rounded on offense. Like I don't think this is a game that you win just by giving the ball to Nick Singleton 25 times. And I don't think it's a game that you can win by having Drew Aller throw it 50 times. I think that you have to find the balance. And I know that balance doesn't necessarily mean 15 carries for Singleton, 15 carries for Allen, 25 carries for Drew Aller. But if you can find a way to have these things play off of each other, I think that Penn State should be in really good shape. I think this is a really big game for that Penn State offensive line. I think that they're going to need to be able to generate some push on the interior. And then, Nolan Rushi, you're going to have to step up and keep those defensive ends at bay. I think that Drew Shelton at this point, really experienced, I think has been solid for them this year. Obviously filling in for Olu Fashanu is a really, really tall task, but I've said it before, I'm not an offensive line guru, but the way that I evaluate things is I feel like there haven't been too many times where I've noticed Drew Shelton this year. So I think that's to his benefit. So it's going to be a really physical game, I think. But it also could turn into a track meet. I think that that's something that is really intriguing about this game. But you look at the trenches, I think that you have to figure out how to set it up for Nick Singleton to hit those home runs, to get into that secondary, and then really put his speed against Oregon's speed. Drew Aller said that this is probably the fastest defense that they've played this year, and I think that's really going to show indoors in this type of environment.
we will get into our players to watch and predictions now. But I just wanted to note here again, with Mark not being available, we're going to lead off both of these with his picks, and I'll just pass them along on his behalf. And his player to watch here, Daniel, is on the special teams for Penn State. He's going with Riley Thompson, punter. He's been Penn State's punter the last couple of seasons. And part of it is Oregon's punter is producing at a program high right now. He has gone back-to-back seasons and establishing new high marks and very effective. So if you get in a situation where field position matters, and certainly it does every game, you don't want to be on the short end of the stick when it comes to that punter battle. But also, Mark noted the return capabilities of Tez Johnson, who missed some time in November, but is Oregon's leading receiver, has been fantastic playmaker for them, and that extends to special teams. He's got an 85-yard touchdown return as a punt returner this year. He's averaging about 12 yards per return, so just something to keep an eye on there. Who's your player to watch, Daniel?
I've got kind of two parts to this. I think that in terms of just a player to watch, very matchup dependent, AJ Harris at cornerback, he's former 5-star recruit, has experience from Georgia, has been around big time programs his career, and has been, I think, a really solid player for Penn State this year. I think he came in and he had a lot of hype given his recruiting pedigree and his experience. And I think that he's lived up to it. And you talk about some of these Oregon wide receivers. You mentioned Tez Johnson. Evan Stewart is a former. I don't know if he was a 5-star or not, but he was a very well-regarded recruit. When he started his career at Texas A&M, and Dylan Gabriel is going to throw the ball a lot. So I think how AJ Harris holds up, if he can make some plays, maybe get his hands on a ball. I think that he's someone who's really important. Just from a bigger picture perspective, I think Abdul Carter is someone to really watch in this game. We talked about what this game can mean for James Franklin earlier. I think when you talk about the Penn State players and you maybe power rank, who can maybe change their perception the most or who can introduce themselves to a national audience more, I think number 1 is Drew Aller, number 2 is Abdul Carter, number 3 is Tyler Warren. I think those 3 guys individually have the most at stake here. One of my friends who's involved in college football was like, Abdul Carter isn't really getting talked about enough, which is really funny to hear from someone in media as opposed to James Franklin. But to a certain degree, I think that's right. There haven't been the same unsolicited pitches for him to be an award winner. There hasn't been kind of the train of thought, really diving into what he's done. And so I think that he's someone who can really impact a game off the edge. He can change a game with a strip sack. And I think that he's someone definitely by the end of the night Saturday, you could have people being like, oh, that's a top 5 pick in the NFL draft. That is a game wrecker. That is someone, fans of teams that are going to be picking near the top of the NFL draft. They could start being like, I think I'd like to see that number 11 in my team's colors next year.
I do not doubt that he will have a moment or two at least in this game where people are convinced of his potential at the next level. But I'm going to go with one of the more obvious picks here too, Tyler Warren. Last time we saw Penn State enter a heavyweight showdown, he didn't have a catch at halftime. And I just think that can't happen again. You can't wait until late to play catch up and have Tyler Warren be a part of that. To me, I know it's easier said than done, but Andy Kotelnicki coming out against this Oregon defense, would love to see him find a way to feed Tyler Warren directly early on in this game and make sure that Oregon has to respect his presence, whether it's getting him involved on those direct snaps that we've seen, although I'm a little hesitant to take Drew Aller away from the quarterback spot, first series. I don't love that. But I think making sure that Tyler Warren has the ball in his hands, whether it's short passes, we know he can stretch the field a bit. I think he has 15 catches of 20-plus yards. But get him rolling by halftime. And that way, Oregon's got to be the one that gets into the locker room and figures out a way to counter you versus you getting into the locker room saying, how do we find a way to get Warren the ball? I think that's a really important chess match within the first couple quarters of this game, and how they come out the other side of halftime, where it stands on Warren, could be a really big factor in how the game finishes out. So let's get to our predictions for this matchup. We'll again start with Mark since he's not with us on this episode. And he is going with Penn State's edge on defense here. He thinks the turnover battle will work in favor of the Nittany Lions and that there'll be a late score and a dramatic win, 28-27. Penn State is his pick, and his bold prediction, he thinks about Nick Singleton here. He says he pops one 50 yards or more against the defense that was gashed for a 70-yarder by Ashton Genty and Boise State, and 53-yarder by Travion Henderson and Ohio State. He says Kajana Carter, who had an 83-yard run against Oregon in the Rose Bowl 30 years ago, will be very proud of that moment. It was a very Mark answer right there, channeling his history covering the team, and he covered that Rose Bowl matchup in January of 1995. What do you have for us in terms of your prediction for the score and of the bold variety?
I've got the same score as Mark, but I have it flipped. I have Oregon 28, Penn State 27. I think this is probably the most difficult game that there's been to pick all year long. And I went back and forth a lot. I just think you look at Dillon Gabriel being a veteran, the talent that they have on the outside, the playmakers that they have on both sides of the ball. I think it's just one of those things where Oregon can get one more play, than Penn State can. I think that they're really battle tested. Obviously, Penn State is too. That's what you get when you get to this point in the year in terms of what these teams have been through. But I just think that Oregon has been through it. They're 12-0 for a reason, and I think that'll carry over. I also think that Dan Lanning has given how aggressive he is, Oregon really has the chance to set the terms of the game early. And I think if Oregon does that, the Ducks will be in really good shape. As for my bold prediction, Heisman voting opened on Monday the 2nd. It goes through Monday the 9th. We know that James Franklin has made his pitch for Tyler Warren. I think with a lot of eyes on this game, we're going to see some manufactured touches for Warren, whether that's sound or not, whether we like it or not. But I think that we get a 100-yard, 2-touchdown performance from Warren in a losing effort where, if someone hasn't filled out their Heisman ballot yet by Saturday night, they look at things and they think that he could be a factor in there.
Yeah, Warren has 4 100-yard games on the season, 5 for his career. That's a Penn State record. I also have Oregon winning closely, 27-24. It feels like everyone's in very much the same ballpark on where the score lands. In fact, our as we swapped questions with another Oregon beat reporter for our Know the Foe series at Lions 24/7, he also had Oregon 27-24. To me, I think you can buy a lot of stock in what Dillon Gabriel is going to be and how he's going to show up to this game and leading the Oregon offense. I'm not saying that I'm not buying stock that Drew Aller is going to show up and be accountable and be the guy that we've seen here for the last 12 weeks. But you look around the field and who they're sharing that field with and how things are trending. I just like what Dillon Gabriel maybe has at his disposal right now, and with his experience that we can lean on. He's got Tez Johnson, trending in a very good direction. This guy is a sensational wide receiver, one of the best in the Big Ten. He was on a tear. Then he got hurt in early November, missed a bunch of the month, got back for the regular season finale, and reminded people what he can do with the football. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, I don't know what kind of state Penn State's leading receiver is going to be in. Is Harrison Wallace going to be 100%? Is he going to be 75%? Is he going to play? If he's limited or he can't go at all, that drastically changes and forces you to use your imagination and say, this receiver is going to step up or this receiver is going to step up. It can't just be Tyler Warren in the passing game. It can't just be Nick Singleton supplementing the passing game as well. And so ultimately, I'm giving Oregon the advantage in finding a way to score more points in this game. 27-24 is where I land, but clearly I think it's going to be hanging in the balance in the final moments. And my bold prediction is I'm going to go to the receiver position here. Julian Fleming, I mentioned it before, last 5 games, 4 catches, 28 yards. He hasn't reached 35 receiving yards in any Big Ten matchup this year. I think he goes over 50 yards. I think he reaches the end zone. At least boldly, I think that. And he's the only guy on this Penn State roster with Big Ten championship game experience. And maybe I'm buying into that a bit too much, but Julian Fleming finishes on a high note in Big Ten action this year. Daniel, we'll see what happens. If we're wrong, we're going to be talking about the Big Ten champions on a post-game podcast in the twilight hours of Saturday into Sunday when we get around to it, you and Indy and me here in our Happy Valley headquarters. But looking forward to breaking it down with you. We've got a couple more days to get a lot of content over at Lions 24/7, looking ahead to this matchup and breaking things down. And don't forget, National Signing Day occurred on Wednesday. So there are many, many articles and pieces over at lions247.com to peruse. But Daniel, appreciate the breakdown, and we'll see what happens Saturday.
Thanks for having me, Tyler. I'm looking forward to the weekend.
we focus in on top-ranked Oregon, 12-0 on the season. The Pac-12 transplant has come to town and firmly planted its flag in the Big Ten, trying to take home the title Saturday night. And to get more information on these Ducks and how they have really flourished in this transition to a new conference, we welcome in Matt Preem, who covers Oregon for the 24/7 Sports Network, has done so for a while, and it's our first chance to cross paths. Thought it might not happen until down the line in a future Big Ten schedule, but surprise, surprise, Ohio State couldn't handle business against Michigan, so Oregon gets Penn State, and we get to talk with Matt Preem, and you'll get to talk with us on your podcast, and on that goes with the collaboration. So first off, excited to work in a little bit of a tandem with you guys in your site this week, and thanks for making room for us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fun time for Oregon fans, and it's a fun time for us because we're working with people that previously we've had very little interactions with, moving from the Pac-12 into the Big Ten and covering all the Big Ten teams. So it's been pretty cool to work with people like yourself, who I think we've both been with the network since it's almost its inception, but we've never crossed paths. And now it's going to become a regular occurrence, which is pretty cool.
And we got a big deal coming our way on Saturday in Indianapolis. Primetime matchup, number 1 team in the country, number 3 team in the country with 1 loss on its resume. So let's go back to last Saturday, though. I'd imagine you all were preparing to write a bunch of content and create a bunch of content about a rematch against Ohio State, what that meant, all the dynamics in play. As Saturday started to develop and it became more apparent that Ohio State was in real trouble and that Penn State might be the team to rise up, what was the reaction in Eugene?
There was definitely probably troll level enjoyment of Ohio State losing, because there's been some animosity between Oregon and Ohio State's fan bases, all the way back to 2009 when they played in the Rose Bowl, and then Oregon lost to Ohio State in 2014 in the national championship game. And when Oregon went to Ohio State in 2021, there was a game. It was a game in which very few people gave them a chance to win, and they won. And then in 2020, they were supposed to come to Ohio State, or Ohio State was supposed to come to Eugene. It didn't really happen because of COVID. And so there was a lot of excitement, frustration, a chance to show like, hey, we're actually as good as you from an Oregon fan perspective this year. And when they played, it was an unbelievable game, one of the best games played ever at Autzen, and it ends in which Ohio State's, I guess, fan base and team talked a lot about the down should have been called a timeout on the slide, the 12th man penalty, and all of that, and so and then they talked a while about how they wanted to get Oregon back, and so I think there was a level of like, that's funny, you guys talked about playing us for so long, and now you don't get to do it. But I think deep down there was also probably a little bit of relief that they're not playing Ohio State, because the roster at Ohio State on paper is as good as anybody's. And that's not to say that Penn State's isn't in the elite level. But I think Ohio State on paper is a more complete game. But as we've seen, like, on paper doesn't matter. You have to still go out and play the game. And, Penn State's going to present a bunch of different challenges for Oregon, and they could very easily lose this game. It's another top 10, another top 5 matchup, and Oregon's going to be outnumbered from a crowd perspective. And then so it was a sense of laughing at an opponent who talked all second half of the season about getting a rematch against Oregon and now not getting it because they choked. And then also, I think deep down, probably a sense of relief of you're not playing maybe the most talented roster in college football.
We've seen Penn State lose 8 straight to Ohio State. We thought it might prevent them from getting Indianapolis again. Ultimately, it didn't because of what Michigan was able to do. I mean, Oregon has been ranked among the top teams in college football since kickoff of this season. But they were 5-0 before that Ohio State game with wins over Idaho, Boise State. Obviously, Boise State's proven to be a college football playoff contender. Oregon State, UCLA, and Michigan State. So their first couple Big Ten matchups in the conference were UCLA, which obviously had its struggles this year. Michigan State certainly had its struggles. What did that 1-point win on October 12th do for Oregon, their confidence, and really the trajectory of this season? It got them to 6-0, but I'd imagine it represent more of a cleared hurdle as a Big Ten conference newcomer to get that done.
Yeah, it was. I mean, they already had the confidence and the belief that they could win that type of a game. But all year, or I should say, like all off season, it's not just Oregon; it's the other three big Pac-12 teams too that joined the league. The biggest talking point that you go to media day, you go to just regular random meeting events with national media and Dan Lanning and the players and the other three coaches and their players were all asked, like, how can you handle the physicality of the Big Ten? How can you handle the travel of the Big Ten? How are you going to handle the defenses and the run games that these teams are going to possess? Because fair or not, and sometimes it's true and sometimes it hasn't been true. The league that was the Pac-12 had a reputation of being a speed offense and being a league built around passing and not being able to win in the trenches when it mattered most. And to an extent, that was true. And so I think that win probably solidified, justified, presented the idea, had most of the people across the country buy in that, okay, yeah, this Oregon team is different. Like Ohio State could not run the football on Oregon consistently. Oregon was able to get pressure on Will Howard consistently with just 4 and sometimes 5 guys rushing the quarterback. And then on the other end of the spectrum, like they were able to go after Ohio State in the run game. They took deep shots because their offensive line was able to protect Dylan Gabriel long enough to let him throw the ball deep. And so it was more of a like, yeah, we've adapted our roster. We've changed, and they have from when Dan Lanning showed up in year 1 in 2022, and when they were being coached and led by Mario Cristobal prior to that. This team is deeper than it's ever been in the trenches, and I think that's probably the biggest improvement from under Dan Lanning. And that Ohio State game, that was what it was. It was a coming out of like, because remember, they didn't even play with Jordan Birch, who's their best defensive lineman in that game. And there was definitely a sense of like, oh boy, how is Oregon going to hold up without their best defensive lineman in this type of a game? And you don't want to say like his absence wasn't felt, but it was standard operation. They moved on as if he was playing.
Dan Lanning came in after being Georgia's defensive coordinator, won a national title in that role. Now 34-5 through 3 regular seasons with Oregon. 12 wins this year, 12 wins last year. Obviously looking for more than 12 moving forward. 10 wins in year 1. When you look at this year 3 squad that he's assembled and the coaching staff and what they've done to get to 12-0, what would you consider defining traits, defining characteristics of this particular version of the Ducks?
The trenches. I just talked a little bit there, but they are so deep up front on the defensive line. Their offensive line recruiting has gone up. It was already really good under Mario Cristobal, but it's in the trenches. And Oregon has rotated a bunch of guys this season at that position group. They've got probably this season 3 or 4 NFL dudes along the defensive line. Jordan Birch is the headliner. Derek Harmon, a transfer from Michigan State, is projected to be a first-round draft pick. Mateo Uyunglele is the sack leader in the Big Ten this season, a former 5-star that will certainly have NFL scouts talking about an early entry next year because he's just not eligible this season. And then Tatum Tuioti and Amari Washington are 2 sophomores that Oregon's coaching staff are super high on. And the defensive line coach has called Amari Washington maybe their most physical guy up front and most violent guy with his hands. And then Jamari Caldwell is a guy from Houston who transferred in, and NFL scouts have been in the press box pretty much every game for Oregon this season. And then talking with a couple of them throughout the year, they're there to watch him and his play against Power 5 competition and see how it plays out. I know that, all those guys, I'm not saying are first-round draft picks, but they'll be on NFL rosters at some point when their college careers end. And that's the difference here for Oregon, is that in Dan Lanning's first season, they posted the lowest sack total in program history since like 86, 85. And it's just because they didn't have the dudes. They didn't have the depth. They didn't have the talent. And in 3 years, it's been completely made over, and they're loaded now at that position. And it's been talent acquisition, and then it's been talent development too, because Bryce Betcher, they're one of their 2 star linebackers. Jeffrey Bossa is the other one. Bossa's a 4-year starter, but Betcher is a guy that walked onto the football program. He's a Eugene area kid, was a baseball player, and as a sophomore was just a special teams guy that was a star on the special teams. Last year, he got in for a couple games as a starter and played in every game, but was kind of a reserve guy. And he took a spot from Justin Jacobs, a transfer from Iowa a couple years ago, one of their best defenders. He took his job this year and has turned into a guy that, an NFL scout told me this year, like, if he wants to go pro in football, because he did get picked by the Houston Astros in baseball this past summer, an NFL team will pick him. He just has to make it clear that he wants to do that. He wants to go that route. And he's turned into, one of Oregon's better players, one of their best players. PFF has him graded, I think, still as the highest player on the roster defensively. And he had a huge sack against Washington this past weekend. So it's been the talent acquisition up front, and it's been the development of guys up front. Their depth at that position has been as good as it's ever been. And it's honestly the difference between the 2014 team that played for the national championship against Ohio State and this team. That 14 team had 2 first-round draft picks along the defensive line, and DeForest Buckner and Eric Armstead. But the drop-off when they had to leave the field was significant. And while Oregon may not have 2 or 3 first-round draft picks on its defensive line this season, they have one. The NFL talent, though, is far better than it was in 2014.
You mentioned talent acquisition, and it's probably long enough that we haven't talked about Dillon Gabriel. He's number 2 all-time in FBS football for passing yards. He's over 18,000 yards. Number 2 all-time for passing touchdowns, 149 of those to his credit. He had a 32 touchdown, 4 interception, 3,500-yard season at UCF, Central Florida. He had a 30 touchdown, 6 interception, 3,600-yard season at Oklahoma last year. And now at Oregon as a year 6 guy, 73.5% pass completion, almost 3,300 yards, 24 touchdown passes to 6 interceptions, and he has 7 touchdowns on the ground as well. So how would you describe the 2024 performance of Gabriel coming in as a highly established, highly regarded transfer quarterback and replacing someone who did a lot of damage at that position for the Ducks? And what exactly is it about him that has helped create this Oregon number 1 major title contender program?
Yeah, he had a tough job. It's crazy to say that about a guy that was so accomplished like you went through prior to his arrival at Oregon, because Bo Nix last season, and even to an extent the year before, was almost flawless as a quarterback, especially in Oregon's system. He set the NCAA record for highest completion percentage, but more importantly, probably Bo Nix's connection and leadership traits that he had of this team. Everyone just did whatever Bo Nix said to do. And a lot of those guys offensively were back. The starting offensive line featured 3 guys from last season that started, and one of the guys that starts now, Nashad Stroller, was on the team last year. He just didn't play. Their tight ends are all back from last year. All the receivers except for Troy Franklin are back. And then you look at their running game, and all the running backs except for Bucky Irving are back. So it was an offensive unit that brought a ton of guys, and Dillon was put into a spot where you had to replace one of the greatest quarterbacks, not just at Oregon, but statistically in college football history, and Bo Nix. And I think he did a really good job of not trying to be Bo Nix, not trying to just replicate everything that Oregon did under Bo Nix, because that's the way they did it, and more so of playing to his strengths. He's more of a willingness runner than Bo Nix was. I think he's also got a little bit more of a willingness to take some deep shots, take a little bit more risk than Bo Nix did. And we saw the good and the bad of that in the first 5 weeks of the season. He threw, I think it was 3 or 4 red zone interceptions in the first 4 or 5 weeks of college football. And there was definitely some like, what's wrong with Oregon's offense? What's wrong with Dylan Gabriel? Murmurs. It wasn't like freaking out, but there was definitely some murmurs there. And it took him a little bit to kind of, I think, get his bearings and truly understand the offense and the strengths of it and where to lean into and where not to lean into. And same with the staff and figuring things out, what works and what doesn't work. But that Ohio State game, he was flawless. He was really, really good in that performance. He threw some of the best deep balls we've seen from Oregon, quarterbacks over the last 10 years in that game. Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson catching touchdown passes. And then ever since then, he's been pretty good. His stats don't show it the last couple of weeks, and he was, admittedly not good at Wisconsin, a game in which they won 16-13. But I think the bigger storyline that is understandable for why Gabriel and the offense struggled, statistically at least, against Wisconsin and Maryland in back-to-back games was Tez Johnson was out with an injury, their best receiver. And he's their most explosive, their best playmaker with the ball in their hands. And he got back for Washington, and Washington's defense, admittedly is not very good. But I don't think it was a coincidence that they tied their season high in points at 49. And they let off the dogs midway through the fourth quarter in that game. And it was because Tez Johnson was back. So Gabriel's really good. He's got a good connection with the team. His leadership's really good. And his experience, that's what Oregon coaches always go back to, is just he's played so much football that he's seen everything. He knows how to react and respond to whatever he sees.
When you look toward Saturday night, where do you lean on the outcome of this one? And ultimately, what do you think are the prevailing factors in Oregon versus Penn State?
I think, first of all, Penn State's defensive line is going to be one of the difference makers of this one for both teams. Abdul Carter is a tremendous pass rusher. And while he doesn't lead the conference in sacks, he might be the best pass rusher in the conference, probably is right now. How Oregon defends him will be interesting, and how well they do it will be interesting. He's one of those guys that it's like, hey, like, you're not going to shut him down. He will create pressures. He will create hurries. He'll create probably sacks for himself or somebody else at some point in this game. It's just, can you limit the damage that he does? I think Dylan Gabriel's a far better quarterback than Drew Aller, and that's not to say Drew Aller's bad, but I just think there's a difference between the two quarterbacks, and these types of games, I think that is a pretty big factor. So I guess if can Penn State hurry up Gabriel's internal clock, because we've seen this year when he's faced pressure, sometimes he gets happy feet, sometimes he kind of like just forces something really quickly. And then on the flip side, like, can Oregon's defensive line and their depth, can they get after Drew Aller, a position that Penn State's protected really well? Like, I think they're top in the Big Ten in sacks allowed, or at least amount of sacks allowed this season at 11. So getting after Penn State's quarterback is something that few teams have been able to do, and you're going to have to be able to do it in this one. And then Tyler Warren, how does Oregon cover this guy? It's going to be difficult. Now, granted, they've played some really good tight ends this season, and they have one themselves. They've got a couple of them, so they can at least simulate to a degree what type of impact that he can do in practice. But like I mentioned with Abdul Carter, it's almost kind of like, can you limit his damage and prevent everyone else from having big days? But ultimately, I think in the end, Oregon's been the most consistent team in college football this season. I think they've shown that they're the elite team that people across the country have talked about. Like, maybe this year's just full of parity. Like that, I think that's Oregon. Oregon's the elite team. They haven't lost the game when they've played a clunker that everyone else has lost. They've won all the big games that they've played. They've played 3 top 10, 25 teams, 2 teams projected in the playoffs. They've won both of those games. They're the only undefeated team. I think Oregon should go into this one, as they are by the sportsbooks, as the favorite. But a game turning in, this is going to be one, though, in the fourth quarter. And that's kind of where Oregon makes its money. They've been really good in the fourth. They've been really bad in the third from a scoring standpoint. But I think I lean towards Oregon. I think it's going to be a good game. I like both teams in the trenches. I just think Oregon's skill guys offensively are better. But if this is a game that's played in the 20s, that's going to favor Penn State. Oregon wants us to turn it into a track meet.
Well, Matt, really appreciate your perspective. We got a few days to figure this one out, and then we'll see how it goes down in Indianapolis on Saturday night. Matt Preem covers Oregon. You want to go check out that site throughout the week for the latest on Penn State's Big Ten championship game opponent. We appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast. We're packing a lot into this week, as you noted from this episode. And for now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.